The U.S. needs to prepare for a kinetic war with China because a new report shows the U.S. could lose within 30 days of fighting. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The U.S. is finally preparing for war with China. And I'm suppressing an I told you so with the side of it's about time. It's why Trump is asserting U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere and pushing hard for the Golden Dome missile defense, the Golden Fleet, a critical minerals trading bloc that may or may not also be golden, and more defense spending. But the U.S. needs to do far more if it wants to deter China, and fast, because as things stand, the U.S. could lose a war to China in 30 days. Not months, not weeks, 30 days. That's how long it takes vampires to take out a town in Alaska. A study called Tidal Wave by the Heritage Foundation looked into two specific kinds of vulnerabilities that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Fuel and munitions, the lifeblood of any military campaign. Unless you're running a vintage axe and longship campaign. No one expects Vikings. The Heritage Foundation based the study on more than 7,000 publicly available government, commercial, academic, operational, and industry sources with the help of AI. And before you roll your eyes and dismiss it as some AI slop, it's apparently accurate enough that the U.S. government requested redactions to the report to avoid providing Beijing with strategic insights that could counter the Pentagon's war plans. So it's less AI slop and more AI plot. And unlike the Epstein files, you can't just copy and paste the black bars to find the hidden juicy details. I would know because I tried. Glad to see someone knows how to properly redact. So, you know they're serious. This is definitely something that we need to keep an eye on, and it paints a very dark picture for the U.S. When it comes to fuel, the study shows that the U.S. is absolutely screwed. It faces a cascading failure in the first 30 days, thanks to very little cargo capacity. Oh no, does this mean cyber trucks might actually be strategically sound? The future of war looks like a vehicle from GoldenEye 64? I'm okay with that. As things stand, the U.S. Navy relies on a tiny fleet of just 15 aging Kaiser-class oilers to meet the Indo-Pacific's entire demand, along with a small number of U.S.-flagged tankers. That's insane. The Heritage Foundation also warns that the U.S. is leaving too many above-ground storage tanks vulnerable to Chinese attacks, because apparently the U.S. is waiting for a Michael Bay movie to kickstart a war. As for missiles, the picture is even worse. According to the Heritage Foundation's timeline, there will be an initial stock depletion in the first roughly 25 days, followed by a protracted collapse through day 120. It's even worse for long-range anti-ship missiles. Precision-guided missiles like long-range anti-ship missiles are depleted in about 1 week. That's less time than it takes to lose a guy. Look, I'm trying to reach out to my female audience. By the way, have I said how much I love the Gilmore Girls lately? Anyway, the U.S. has less than 250 operational long-range anti-ship missiles, even though it should have over 1,000 to deter China. Mk-48 torpedoes just barely fare better. At projected consumption rates, the entire Mk-48 inventory could be expended as soon as day 70. In a war with China, the U.S. looks like it would lose platforms, ammunition, and/or fuel more than 2 times faster than China, meaning that it may reach the point where it can no longer continue operations fast. Thanks to the issues mentioned as well as others, from slow reloading to slow ammunition production, to the prospect that China will pummel American platforms flat with overwhelming firepower, it really seems like the U.S. shouldn't have given away so much manufacturing and influence to China. So yeah, it's not looking good. You might even be wondering why China hasn't already attacked Taiwan if the U.S. is so weak. But there is a bright side. China has tons of vulnerabilities as well. One of China's greatest weakness is its dependence on oil imports. So in a war between the two countries, the biggest winner would be environmentalists. Imports made up over 70% of China's total oil consumption in 2023. And 80% of that comes from the Strait of Malacca. That and the Indian Ocean are huge choke points where the U.S. could impose blockades and deny China access to oil. So a war would be mutually assured destruction of deliveries. The U.S. could also cripple China's oil supply by physically or electronically striking China's oil infrastructure. And there are lots of potential targets to choose from. There are the terminals that handle very large crude carriers, fixed unhardened piers and fuel loading facilities, and inland transport corridors like mountain passes and bridges. Any strike on them could create bottlenecks for China's oil supply, and some of them aren't designed with redundancy in mind. I know, shocking, something built by China that was poorly thought out. But what would especially devastate China are strikes on unhardened Chinese refineries. This is something that China cannot afford to experience. These refineries literally fuel China's entire military complex. Who knew it would be such a bad idea putting all of their eggs in one basket? There should be a saying against doing that sort of thing. Rebuilding them wouldn't be easy either. It's the kind of technology that's so complex that it would take years to repair. In addition, China can't afford to let the refineries go offline even for a moment, because having them shut down and turn on again can cause serious complications. It's why refineries need years in advance of planning to safely turn off, get repairs, and turn on again. It's the opposite of literally everything else, where turning it off and on again fixes the problem. This somehow makes it worse. It's also why China would need to keep close watch over the local substations that keep refineries up and running. The same goes for China's fixed pipeline networks, especially those near ports, depots, and bases. Even a single break or valve failure could screw over China's oil distribution. There are even more glaring vulnerabilities than the Death Star having an exhaust port that blows up the entire station. Now, of course, these kinds of attack scenarios that the Heritage Foundation brings up could also be applied to Chinese attack on U.S. infrastructure. But I think it's important to know that logistics sabotage goes both ways. We sometimes get so caught up with the idea that China can sabotage the world's infrastructure that we forget the U.S. and others can do the same right back. Even if China manages to secure its oil infrastructure from U.S. attacks, there's another problem. In fact, it's perhaps the Chinese Navy's biggest weakness. China just doesn't have enough ships for replenishing supplies while the Navy is moving. These are known as underway replenishment ships. It only has 2 Type 901 fast combat support ships, which support China's aircraft carrier groups, and 9 Type 903A replenishment oilers. These are vital for keeping China's combat ships going further out into the ocean and for longer periods of time. Refueling in the middle of the ocean is a very dangerous feat that requires a lot of caution. So relying on just a few ships to fuel China's entire navy is just asking for trouble. Crew members get extremely stressed, and mistakes will happen. Losing even just a few of them, either to enemy fire or worse, self-sabotaging slip-ups, could be a death sentence to China's naval ambitions. Now, let's look at China's munitions system. This is actually one of China's greatest strengths. China knows that it likely cannot beat the U.S. head-on, which is why it's put so much emphasis on building up the ability to produce missiles at a much faster rate than the U.S. This is possible thanks to China's reliance on 5 core state-owned conglomerates, and each control most of their own supply chains and highly specialized production systems. But this strength could also theoretically be a weakness. The Heritage Foundation believes that a U.S. attack on some of these enterprises' plants could damage China's ability to produce precision-guided munitions and even get rid of some production lines. Given that a lot of state-owned enterprise facilities rely a lot on automation and systems that can produce multiple types of munitions, it stands to reason then that taking those out and the equipment inside them would likely cause cascading disruptions to multiple munition types. There's also potential in using China's military-civilian fusion against China. That's where every civilian enterprise basically doubles as a military one. Think a civilian communications network that the PLA uses. Well, that could be vulnerable to U.S. sabotage, especially through cyber attacks on commercial rail, port, and IT networks. Though given the amount of explosions that happen in Chinese buildings even during peacetime, I really wonder if it's even going to be necessary for the U.S. to conduct strikes. There's a good chance Chinese factories will ignite without the U.S. lifting a finger. It's like that old saying, never correct your enemy when they're making a mistake. Don't remember who said that, so I'll assume it was Churchill. It's always Churchill. Remember, the U.S. and the rest of the world relies on China for so many things, but China also relies on the world as well. China needs components for refineries, as well as a bunch of other foreign-sourced technology, including the kind used for missiles. Putting sanctions on them could put China in a very tight spot. Let me remind you that there are a bunch more vulnerabilities for both the US and China that the Heritage Foundation initially wrote down, but then redacted. With all this said, we shouldn't assume that China is so vulnerable that the US can easily beat China. It's like that old saying, great kid, don't get cocky, by Churchill. As I've been saying for a while now, China continues to build the largest navy in the world, and it's mostly concentrated in the Indo-Pacific, unlike the US, which is more spread out worldwide. On top of having the home advantage, China has large-scale manufacturing capabilities, a civilian fleet at its beckoning, and a massive missile arsenal that can overwhelm the US. Meanwhile, the US has a hollowed-out shipbuilding industry that desperately needs reviving. Study after study and war games have consistently shown that in the event war breaks out over Taiwan, the US at best wins Pyrrhic victories over China, but not before suffering massive losses. That's why we need to think more on how to get logistics right with fuel, munitions, and everything else that goes into waging military campaigns. What good is having a ton of big guns if we can't even get them to the enemy and shoot? Unless you're running a vintage axe and longship campaign, no one expects Vikings. And remember, stay up to date on the latest China news by signing up for my free weekly newsletter. Just click this button or the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.